DWR is committed and moving forward with large-scale, long-term, sustainable habitat restoration in the Delta, Sassoon Marsh, and Yellow Bypass. These goals are driven by the need to reestablish ecological processes and aquatic habitat that support listed native fishes. The design and function of the projects will need to balance between habitat and food web production, and DWR is committed to monitoring and adaptive management of these near-term projects so that we can ensure that they function as intended and we learn from our experience.
I have one question, and what is the connection between salinity levels? We've heard in the earlier panels that X2 moves up and moves down, and it's tidally shifting, and I assume seasonally shifting as well. Are you looking at these habitats and the, kind of when you want the water to come in from a salinity perspective, or not? I mean,
Well, I think that would only pertain to the work in Sassoon Marsh. When you get up into the Cache Slough area and Yellow Bypass, those are freshwater systems up there.
Okay.
I don't know how to, we're not the lead on the Sassoon Marsh projects, at least us up here, so I don't know how to answer that question. Other than to say, we're trying to restore historical processes wherever we can. And
Paul, I know you're not here to give a presentation, but I want to call on you. When you came before us during our famous or infamous Delta flow hearings, I thought comments that you made and your counterpart, Mr. Lehigh at DWR, were very sobering. And my colleagues on either side of me immediately were here. We have 2 new colleagues since that time, but during that proceeding, we were talking like a bunch of bobbleheads about adaptive management and pulse flows, and it was like a feeding frenzy. We were going to change flows every 12 hours, and when the moon was just right, we were going to do this and that. And I think it would help if you told my new colleagues what your enormous responsibility is and how you viewed the efficiencies or lack thereof when we were telling you we were going to change this week and this next week and do all this. I thought your comments were very sobering and were very much a credit to your knowledge. If you wouldn't mind doing that, I would appreciate it. But tell them what you do so they know how much responsibility you have.
Oh, thank you.
And I'm not saying that to pick on you. I just was very impressed with what you told us. It was very sobering.
Okay, I'll see what I can do. I'm Paul Fujitani. I'm the Deputy Operations Manager in the Century Valley Operations Office. So in our office, we do the planning and operations of the Century Valley Project, as Chairman Hoppin noted. And I wasn't here I didn't have any planned presentation, prepared remarks or anything. And actually, we did plan on discussing more of operations and operational challenges and trade-offs and modeling at the next workshop. We're here to do what he's doing right now, answer some questions that might come up. So anyway, I think what you might have been referring to is, from an operator's perspective, we like certainty so we can plan for it and get things scheduled and get it all planned out. But one of the biggest challenges we have right now in a lot of the operations, and I heard some comments today about monthly numbers and daily numbers may not be what we need. You need more consideration of the tidal inflow. You can imagine that my eyebrows went up and said, oh, tidal operations, that's going to be a real challenge. For us, a lot of our operations rely very heavily on weather forecast, forecast of tidal conditions in the Delta. And then not only that, when we plan our operations, we have to schedule our operations. And with the power market we have nowadays, I think both us and the State Water Project have to plan our operations or schedule it out 3 days in advance. So today's Monday. This morning by 10 o'clock, we had to schedule our releases and actually tune in our operations, schedule them for Wednesday already. Adding to some of that complexity is we're evaluating Delta conditions right now. And Under this time of year, typically we're operating for delta salinity conditions to maintain our Contra Costa chlorides. So right now we're looking at conditions in the western part of Delta to see what kind of outflow and what kind of releases we might need to support or to manage the chloride standards. And so we're trying to get forecasts of what may be happening a few days out, since we're scheduled for Wednesday already. And the other problem we have is that if we need, well, let me take a step back. There's 3 ways we can generally manage for salinity in the Delta. We can change our exports, we can change the Delta cross-channel gate configurations, or we can change our releases upstream at the reservoirs. So if we needed a change in reservoir operations at Shasta, that's a 5-day travel time away. Oroville's 3 days away. Folsom's about 1 day away. So Shasta, for the most extreme example, if we need 5 days, taking into account 5 days of travel time, add into that maybe 3 days needed for the power market planning, scheduling. Actually, it's 3 days on a good day. On weekends and holidays, we have to schedule ahead 5 days. But anyway, add that to the 5 days of the travel time, and we have to predict what kind of flows we need from Shasta 7 to 10 days, maybe 2 weeks in advance. So that's some of the operational challenges we've got, trying to make sure that we can get the water to the Delta in time to manage to the different standards we have. Is that part of it?
That was exactly what I wanted to hear, Paul. Thank you. I mean, you know, we have things that we're trying to do, but you have enormous responsibilities, and I think you touched on that quite well, as does DWR. So. Is that it? Thank you all very much.
Charlie?
Yes.
I just heard from the lead of the final panel of the day. That panel will only require 30 minutes, so we're in good shape for getting out of here before 8. So.
Yeah. Ron, you know, we usually pick on you, but you can say something voluntarily if you like, since nobody's picking on you today. I mean, usually when you're here, it's just a free-for-all, but I mean,
it's probably against my better judgment to say anything, but I will say, as a teaser for the third workshop, one of the themes that we probably want to at least bring up is the interaction of some of these delta outflow considerations with cold water management, building cold water pools upstream. Every time we've kind of discussed this within BDCP, this process, even with the Stewardship Council, it's been, how do we do that in a smart way and not kind of create a further issue upstream with, and again, we're talking about some of the same species. A lot of our salmon species really depend on a robust cold water pool, and that sometimes is going to fly in the face of some spring outflows. So we're going to have to be really cautious about how we deal with that, and that's one of the things we want to bring at the third workshop. So just a feature of what could come ahead.
very good.
Okay.
Thank you. If the next panel would like to come up, we have a scheduled break. If anybody needs one, they could probably do it while the next panel is coming up. I know it's going to take a second. Let's see.
That's okay. It's just, you know.
She's sitting there watching. She's watching. Actually, we didn't really take a break. Ladies and gentlemen, we're ready to go with this panel, so this self-imposed break that some of you seem to be taking is over. When we start talking, they'll come back, Brock. Is Mr. Rosenfield absent? I thought I saw him. Can you start without him? We're ready if you guys are ready. Your leader's absent. Whichever of you is the first presenter, go ahead and start. If he's not here, it's his problem, I guess. Green button.
Well, members of the board and board staff, good afternoon. I'm John Rosenfield, conservation biologist with the Bay Institute, and I'm here to talk to you today about the freshwater flow criteria that we believe are necessary to support our public trust fisheries. I'm going to talk about winter and spring delta outflow and delta hydrodynamics, and then finish up by talking about how we think we can make decisions in the face of uncertainty, and my colleagues will talk more about Sacramento River inflows and upstream protections. Starting with delta outflows, the board has a very strong scientific basis for significantly increasing winter-spring delta outflows. Central Valley diversions have increased substantially over time, as illustrated in part by this graph of State Water Project and Central Valley Project exports through the decades. The magnitude, timing, and duration of peak flows has been radically altered, as illustrated down here, this blue line being the unimpaired hydrograph for 2010 of delta inflow, and the red line being the actual hydrograph. This alteration in the hydrograph with the loss of many of the peaks, as you've heard before earlier today, has impacts on the attributes of viability, the life history diversity of many fish species. And with that, of course, populations of numerous fish and invertebrate species have declined precipitously. There are connections between the timing, magnitude, frequency, and duration of flow and the viability of native fish species, and these connections are numerous and strong. As I described last time, the increasing outflow is critical because the Bay Delta estuary is currently experiencing a man-made and permanent drought. Here I've depicted delta outflow through the years. The size of the bars indicates the volume of water, and the color of the bars indicates a water year category, with blue representing wet years and yellow below normal years, orange dry years, etc. And then we've added in a category of supercritical years, the black bars, which occur, those are the 2.5% driest years. They occur very infrequently in nature. And then we've plotted that as for the unimpaired hydrograph and for actual outflows as seen by organisms that live in the area of delta outflow. As I reviewed last time, in the years since 1967, there have been 11 wet years hydrologically speaking, but for organisms in the delta outflow zone, they've experienced only 4 years that would appear to be wet to them in terms of flows. Conversely, supercritical years have occurred once since 1967, that being 1977, but fully 17 times in that period, in those 45 years, organisms in the delta outflow zone have experienced an environment that appeared to be as dry as 1977 or thereabouts, so more than a third of the time. In our 2010 analysis of flow criteria necessary to support public trust fisheries, we identified four different geographies of flow: delta outflows, delta inflows from the San Joaquin and the Sacramento, and in delta hydrodynamics. And we kind of mapped those onto four attributes of viability for species. All species, in order to be viable, need to have an adequate abundance, spatial extent, life history diversity, and genetic diversity as well, and productivity or resilience. And then we took those categories and those particular flows and looked at individual species that where data existed to illustrate the flows that would be needed to maintain that particular attribute of viability in that location. One example of the analysis that we did was to look at delta outflow with regard to longfin smelt abundance. Frequently we see graphics of longfin smelt abundance from a fall midwater trawl or a base study plotted against flow. And what those graphics don't incorporate, that graphic implies that add water and you get fish. But of course the amount of fish that you get is dependent on the amount of fish that you started with to a certain extent. And so our analysis was to take the population change, the growth or decline of populations from one generation to the next and map that against flow, from which we developed this relationship with population declines being these negative numbers here, population increases above the zero line. For a variety of analytical and statistical reasons, it was better to take these what we call residuals, these population changes, and just convert them into ones and zeros. 1 here, 0 here. 0 meaning population decline, 1 meaning population growth, and then map that against flow. And running a logit analysis, a logit regression through these points, we could have chosen another technique to go through the points, but we felt this was a good technique to get an estimate of when is the likelihood of population growth approximately 50%. And that's the point where this curved line crosses the straight line. When the likelihood of population growth is about 50%, you know, those are the flows associated with some level of certainty about population growth. We used that point, that intercept, to tether our flow recommendations and say that in 50% of years, we would like the likelihood of population growth for longfin smelt to be 50% or greater. This is not to say that they will grow, the population will grow in 50% of years, just that the likelihood is better than flipping a coin. And so we use that flow recommendation for the 50% exceedance to develop a percent unimpaired, sort of percent unimpaired flow approach and generate a recommended frequency distribution for delta outflow, which is depicted as this green line. Again, this is a exceedance graph, so this is the percentage of time on the x-axis that flows are greater than a given outflow. So we're getting drier as we go to the right. The red line here is depicts the frequency distribution of flows from 1988 through 2009, so a more recent period. The blue is the frequency distribution of outflows from 1956 to 1987, and the orange boxes are the unimpaired flow. So we modeled our flow requirements on that analysis that I showed you earlier of what would it take to get the population growing, and also with some reference to what have we already seen in the 1956 through 87 period. The difference in the 50% year between what we have seen recently, the median year between what we've seen recently and what would be needed to have the population grow 50% of the time is large. We're talking about a difference of about, and I'm just eyeballing it, about 20,000 CFS on average for the spring months to approximately 35,000 CFS. That 75% improvement in median flows versus the recent period, 1988 to 2009, again, is what's necessary biologically to produce a higher frequency of population growth, which of course is what you want to see with a species that's declining towards extinction. I'll note also that our recommended hydrograph creates the possibility of extracting more water from the system during wetter years. That can be seen here. In subsequent research, pushing this analysis a little further of what do the actual population growth dynamics look like for longfin smelt, a colleague of mine in the Fish and Wildlife Service and I have found that given current flow patterns, longfin smelt populations will not stabilize until the populations are virtually or actually extinct. If we continue down the path we've been on for the past several decades, longfin smelt will be extirpated. I shouldn't use the word extinct because they swim in other waters as well. But in a forthcoming analysis, we'll be recommending a new minimum flow criteria down here that says that in the very driest of years, a floor flow needs to be maintained, as well as this percentage unimpaired when that's possible in wetter years. I want to reiterate that there are strong and widespread connections between spring delta outflow and the viability of numerous species. In our 2010 analysis, we looked at starry flounder and bay shrimp and found that the flows necessary for longfin smelt population growth are consistent with improved abundance of other pelagic species and food web productivity. The second part of my presentation is about delta hydrodynamics. The board, again, has a very strong scientific basis for limiting net negative, or what's commonly called reverse flows, in the South Delta. On average, every year, tens to hundreds of millions of fish are entrained by South Delta export. Here is a table showing 20 species and the average amount of salvage, that's kind of fish measured in hand times the estimation process, right? But it's not including fish that don't make it to the salvage facility, that either get exported because the salvage screening process doesn't work, or because they get eaten before they get to the screens. But we're looking at averages that are in the millions for certain fish species and maximums that are sometimes above 10 million. In addition to the number of fish that are exported, along with that water, and as a result of the altered hydrodynamics, a substantial fraction of delta primary productivity is exported from the delta via the South Delta exports. And primary productivity being green algae-like things that are the base of the food web, but this wouldn't include shrimp and larval fish and other things that are actually food as well. We've spent a lot of time on entrainment as an abundance issue, and you've heard people say that it's difficult to detect statistically abundance impacts on entrainment because of their episodic nature. But we know that entrainment has impacts on the abundance of some species. There are a wealth of studies on this topic, and for some species, entrainment mortality or salvage mortality is an episodic and substantial impact to the population. Wim Kimmerer's 2008 paper provides some estimate. These are for salmon populations, and you can see numbers above 10 or even 40% of the population as a proportion are entrained every year. In a reanalysis of that paper, Wim Kimmerer wrote, a loss of delta smelt, talking about delta smelt now, to export pumping on the order reported in his earlier analysis can simultaneously be nearly undetectable and devastating to the population. This illustrates how inappropriate statistical significance is and standard statistical techniques are in deciding whether an effect is biologically relevant. In addition to the abundance effects, though, there are life history impacts of entrainment processes. In a slide that I've borrowed with permission from Dr. Bill Bennett, he writes that intergenerational loss of life history variation, i.e. unnatural selection, is a pressure that reduces adaptive fit. And similar life history impacts would be expected for other species, including longfin smelt and Chinook salmon. Mr. Colston described eloquently this morning how the impact of the South Delta pumps and their kind of impact zone and their zone of entrainment, the reverse flows, presents a range constriction for a bunch of native delta species. With the consistent mortality and poor south delta conditions, it's no wonder that we don't find delta smelt too often in this area anymore, or longfin smelt, and that San Joaquin salmon have difficulty leaving, exiting the system or re-entering the system. We know that range restriction increases the susceptibility to catastrophic events, and so this is yet another impact of entrainment. Finally, for talking about the impacts of entrainment and South Delta exports, there's a loss of productivity at both the population level, meaning that the growth, the ability of species to grow, capitalize on good conditions is limited when there's this constant source of mortality or a fluctuating source of mortality, but that is consistent. And there's also a system-wide loss of productivity due to the export of food items. So in their forthcoming paper, Drs. Klern and Jasby write, water export from the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta is a direct source of mortality to fish, and export plus within delta depletion alters system energetics of an already low productivity ecosystem by removing phytoplankton biomass equivalent to about 30% of delta primary production. So just to put this in context, if the space between us here is a railway boxcar, about 3 50-foot boxcars of water and the food items that are within it are exported from the system every second. And so that's what that looks like. So imagine 3 trains coming through here every second filled with food. Basically, the point is that if we're worried about food limitation in this ecosystem, then we have to be worried about the export of food from the South Delta pumping operations. Specific levels of in-delta flow that are consistent with maintaining public trust resources remain undetermined. So yes, there is some uncertainty about exactly what number OMR flow should be and exactly what dates, and that may differ from species to species. But there is no compelling scientific evidence supporting maintenance of quasi-permanent net negative flow conditions, particularly in drier years. I have pictured here delta smelt. This is true for salmon as well. We heard earlier this morning some doubt from some of the presenters about whether OMR flows are truly a mechanism leading to entrainment of salmon, and it's difficult to believe that they would not be. The evidence and what we know about salmon life history and ecology, it certainly bears that out. This is a slide, again, from Bill Bennett that he presented in 2012. He states quite emphatically his feelings about the impacts of exports on delta smelt. The flows required to prevent extinction of endangered species, which is what we've been talking about largely today, delta smelt, longfin smelt to a certain extent, winter run Chinook salmon, those requirements are not necessarily the requirements that adequately protect other species. So since 2008, we've had OMR restrictions and inflow export restrictions from the biological opinions that are designed to prevent jeopardy to endangered species. During that time, the number of days when reverse flow is negative on average has remained pretty high. We're talking about 2/3 of the year. You can see back in an earlier period that that number was usually 0. But now we're about 2/3 of the year when reverse flows are the state of nature. And so since the 2008 period, we've seen large entrainment effects on other fish species in the delta that we don't often talk about. Sacramento sucker, white sturgeon, Sacramento splittail, longfin smelt have each experienced in one year or another entrainment events that are among the highs that we've ever seen. And of course, these populations are near the lows that we've ever seen. So again, the minimum standards in a biological opinion may not be the standards that we need to protect the public trust. We can develop delta hydrodynamic objectives to protect the public trust resources, or at least a first shot to go into management with and learn, see how they work. We know that OMR flows index entrainment risk for some species. This is from Lenny Grimaldo's work in 2009 for the pelagic species delta smelt, longfin smelt, striped bass. And what these graphs show is that when OMR flows are negative to the left of 0, entrainment rates and risks are quite high for each of these species, and that when OMR flows are positive, entrainment or salvage risk goes down substantially. OMR is an indicator, okay, and it's designed to be related to a mechanism. We have fish in our hands, right? I mean, they got there somehow, and the OMR flows are designed to index how likely that entrainment is happening. Could there be another index, another flow metric that would work better? Yeah, and there could be different ones for different species, and as we move along, we may find those. But for right now, I've yet to see a better index or a better indicator of hydrodynamic conditions in the delta that put fish at risk than OMR flows. As Pat Colston also mentioned, entrainment of many pelagic fishes increases when outflow is low. So here we have longfin smelt total salvage on a log axis and against delta outflow from March to May in 1,000 acre-feet. And we see that this entrainment rate drops precipitously. It's a very statistically significant relationship as flows increase. And this is consistent with our understanding of spawning and early rearing requirements for these fish. They basically appear to track the low salinity zone, whether it's 2 parts per thousand or 1.5 parts per thousand or 3 parts per thousand. They're moving in concert with that area of salinity when they reproduce and when they rear. So if that area is closer to the pumps, then, which is what happens when outflows are low, then fish get entrained. If that area is away from the pumps, then fish don't get entrained, at least for this species. Public trust flow objectives for delta hydrodynamics, then, I believe, must do more than avoid extinction. They can be managed adaptively in real time and across water quality control plan triennial review periods, perhaps, to learn what works. But the requirements of the biological opinions to avoid jeopardy have to be the floor or the lower limit of the adaptive range of OMRs. And OMR flows greater than 0 CFS, in other words, positive flows during ecologically sensitive seasons, will be necessary during drier years and or when abundance falls below critical thresholds. I mean, we're talking about whether rivers flow to the ocean or not. So in other parts of the world, if I explain to them that we have a protective standard and it only allows the river to flow backwards a little, I get odd looks. There's, as I said, little scientific justification at this point for protecting species with negative flows. The upper end of the adaptive range should include net positive flows with durations that increase as hydrology permits, and perhaps there's room to do some experiments in there, as I said, to learn adaptively. So finally, I want to talk about addressing uncertainty in a planning framework. There is uncertainty in the system, and the board and any planning process can do a lot to put a fence around that, to constrain that uncertainty and gradually reduce it over time. And the way that we can do that is by asking and then answering a set of questions and recording our uncertainties and our assumptions in those answers. The questions are of the nature of what specific measurable ecological outcomes represent adequate protection of the public trust. How will we know when we're done? And by when should those targets be attained? What stressors prevent the attainment of those goals and targets currently? I should emphasize that there are many stressors in this system. Many of them are flow related and a few of them are not. I'm not meaning to suggest that the board is fully responsible for attaining all of our global goals and objectives in this system, just that we need to know what we're trying to attain so that we know whether flow criteria or other actions are consistent with that and are doing enough. Of course, we have to know how much change specifically we're trying to achieve in those stressors. If predation is a problem, how much do we need to reduce predation, if we could measure that? If growth is a problem, how much do we want to increase growth? Not because we know the exact number, but because we need to know what order of magnitude this problem is in order to scale our actions appropriately and to measure whether we've succeeded. in this system, we have biological outcomes, goals, and targets that have been identified for the system as a whole. And again, I want to emphasize that I don't think it's the board's responsibility or possible for flow alone to solve all these problems. This is a both and, not an either or. For salmonids and sturgeon, we have a doubling criteria that's embedded in federal and state law, doubling salmon populations from the 1967 to 1991 average. And what we would need to do to build on this would be for the board and or the trustee organizations, the trustee agencies, to say, by when are we going to achieve these doubling standards, given that we didn't achieve them the first time around. The San Joaquin Restoration Settlement Act and the recovery plans have additional goals in there that are global, that flow criteria contribute towards. And similarly, for pelagics, the draft Fish and Wildlife Service recovery plan of 1995, until it's followed up with a newer plan, sets targets that are to attain population dynamics from the 1967 to 84 period. And again, we would simply need to add a time bound on that, and we'd be off to the races in terms of how to proceed to attain that target. I want to also address some red herrings that we've heard today and heard that I've read in the testimony and heard last week. We've heard about regime change today, and it's all of a sudden everybody's talking about regime change. And the notion of regime change sounds to me very much like a concept that's pretty outdated in ecology, of static, steady state environments that we reach a certain place and then everything stays the same. And in ecology, there are no regimes. They don't change because they never existed. It's constant change. But this notion of regime change is used in a context very often of targets that say we have to settle for less, or that this near extinction is the best we can do, and that we're in an era of permanent scarcity. And I don't think that that's true. I certainly don't think that there's any science to support that. With the flow and habitat improvements necessary for some species, e.g. the smelt, other species like split-tail and salmon could do substantially better than we've witnessed in our sampling period, which began in 1967 for most species, which was after we lost most of the habitat. So, and flows have been declining since then. So I don't think that, we may not be able to attain certain targets that represent the past for certain species, but there's no reason that we can't far exceed what we've seen in the past for other species. Another red herring that's out there, or discussion that I hear in the hallways, is that the 2010 flow criteria report is too aggressive, and the board should take a moderate approach to tweaking flow criteria and using adaptive management to better understand the problem and evaluate potential solutions. And we hear this mantra of adaptive management, adaptive management, adaptive management. And as I mentioned last time, adaptive management is no panacea. In fact, it's going to be very hard work to figure out what's working and what's not. And what makes adaptive management and piecemeal solutions difficult is, for one, there's the complexity of the system, but then there's the status of the public trust resources to begin with. These are 4 species. I could have chosen another 4 and even a different 4 to illustrate the point that the precarious nature of the Bay Delta's public trust resources doesn't really provide a lot of scope for small changes and an incremental approach where we kind of ratchet things up. I think we heard in the workshop number 1, I believe it was from Dr. Summer, who said that if you want to see results and know whether something's working, you have to send a big signal. And these species, having experienced 99% declines or 99.9% declines or worse, are really not in a situation where we can see how it goes by just nudging things a little bit. We really need more aggressive conservation actions than we've had so far. So in summary, improvements in delta outflow and delta hydrodynamic conditions are absolutely necessary. They're not going to be sufficient alone, but they're absolutely necessary to protect and restore native fishes and invertebrates. Scientifically supported flow recommendations that are necessary to support various elements of the public trust are contained in our earlier submissions to the board, and we're working to update those as new information becomes available and as we do new analyses. Adaptive management is appropriate to address uncertainty regarding specific parameters, but it can't be a rationale for inadequate protection of imperiled resources. Thank you.
I believe the Bay Institute is part of BDCP. Are you sitting in on the BDCP discussions?
Yes, the Bay Institute participates in the BDCP.
And are there discussions about some of the issues that you've raised here? Because that really wasn't presented in the earlier BDCP presentation.
Whenever I'm in the room, that's part of the discussion. Yes.
Is there receptivity? I guess I'm sure you're.
Yeah, I mean, well, there's receptivity. If Gary's in the room, there's receptivity, I should say. But I also want to say about the presentation that we've heard about the peripheral canal and about entrainment. There's a question that I'm hoping that you all can answer for me, because as long as I've been in the BDCP room, the discussion is that conservation measure number one is this peripheral canal that will take water from the north, route it around to the south, so we have operational flexibility to shut off South Delta exports at certain key times. And that, to me, has always been an argument to avoid entrainment. But then at the same time, I hear people saying that entrainment is not a problem. So, I'm caught in between those two things. It's hard to hold those two notions at the same time. So we do argue we do believe entrainment is a problem, and that this flexibility is an interesting avenue to pursue as a potential conservation measure. But it's not going to solve the problem entirely, and none of the other things that were discussed are going to work fast enough or well enough without increased freshwater flows.
One question. Is there, in your mind, given sort of where we've come, and we heard about this, some success, let's say, with the spring flow management from some people's perception, but not the fall. I mean, going forward, you talk about freshwater flows, but we're also interested in people's opinions about the seasonality, and if we need to emphasize certain parts of the year. Do you have any suggestions?
Well, I don't want to choose between children, but both are going to be essential. I mean, most of the information that I showed you was on winter-spring outflow. That's been heavily impacted. The results, the science behind fall outflows is newer information, and sort of fall outflows are a necessary action that appears to be necessary because of the degraded state of the delta. Those aren't the natural flow states, but the fall flows do correspond with improved delta smelt survival, probably because the delta is not a good place to be winter, spring, summer, fall. The winter, spring outflows are the natural pattern of the hydrograph. You have these big winter, spring pulses of flow and periodicity, or variability in that sends signals, and that's really when the production of the delta increases, and most of the native species in one way or another are queuing in on those winter spring flows. The salmon, for instance, winter, spring, fall, late fall, that's when they enter the system. They all migrate as juveniles in the winter spring, and that's probably to take advantage of that natural flow pulse.
Mr. Chairman, members of the board, my name is Renee Henry. I'm the California Science Director for Trout Unlimited. And before I dive into this, I just want to honor your stamina. And also the challenge of information filtering that's before you. And since this is my first time in front of you, I'm just going to take a quick moment to say a little bit about context, or our engagement. I think TU submitted written testimony, as you're all aware, on behalf of ourselves and some partner organizations. And really, that was just by way of support in terms of assembling and assessing science that's happened in the last couple years. And I'm not going to take a huge amount of your time today. I really appreciate the sequence of things because I think we've heard a lot already from folks with the agencies and the appointed panel that did a really good job of assembling the existing scientific information. So what I'm going to try to do is just take sort of a slight step back and just highlight some of the themes that I see emerging from the recent science. And I think those themes, from my perspective at least, are fairly consistent with the science to date. So it should all be things that we've heard before, but I just kind of want to underscore. Oh. I roll it, okay. How do I get that to go away? There we go. Oh. So a few key points that I just want to highlight. So if you tune out and forget everything else, at least you remember these. I'm going to put them up front. Inflows to the delta are really important. Water is sort of the baseline. And, you know, we've heard a lot about the details of their importance, what other factors there are, what other variables there are that are affecting their importance. But the bottom line for fish is, and it sounds like an obvious statement, if there's no water, no dice, you know. So the amount of water is really a critical factor. And there's a range of benefits from inflow. There's increased survival, there's improved outmigration, there's floodplain inundation, and there's life history strategy diversification. We've heard about all of those today, and they're interrelated. They really work together, and they work synergistically in some cases, and they work independently, simultaneously in other cases. But they're all part of the benefit of more water. And also, I just want to highlight that thinking about inflow, thinking about flow levels, you really need to take a whole system perspective. And it was, you know, it was right around the time I think that I started graduate school that the word watershed started to become really popular. And I've noticed that as you scale up, it becomes increasingly difficult to maintain that perspective. But we really have a unique system in California where all of this massive area does drain through this one little constriction point. And being an angler-based organization that is interested in fishing all over the place, among other things, we're concerned about how flows in the delta affect the whole range of the tributaries that we're engaged on. So that's sort of the third point I want to highlight. Oop, there we are. So something we've heard today, but I really don't think it can be stressed enough, is that salmonids and native fish in general in California are really on the precipice. And there was some really good work done by Peter Moyle and others, and by Jacob Katz and others, both in the last couple years, highlighting not only the imperiled state of native fish and of our salmonids specifically, but also that our ESA listing does not the greatest job of really telling us the story of how bad things are. So, you know, I won't belabor that point, but it really, you know, bears pause. It warrants pause. And the main causes of decline for those species are flow alteration, loss of access to upstream rearing habitat, loss of floodplain habitat, alterations to the estuary also, and then we've also heard about hatcheries, and certainly those are a factor. But I focus on the three that I listed there because those are really the ones that I feel like in this context we have the potential to make some significant changes to. I won't spend too much time here because we've heard a lot about winter run Chinook salmon today, and I won't belabor that point except to say that, you know, there were 2 coated wire tag winter run Chinook salmon caught in the ocean fishery from brood years 2004, 5, 6, 7, and 8. 2. So it just gives you a sense of really what that graph means in terms of actual numbers of fish. Very few fish. And in terms of spring run, I think the thing that I'd like to highlight is they're a species that are very habitat limited. And even in situations like the San Joaquin restoration, which I spend a lot of time thinking about, where you have the potential to really significantly bolster their populations, you're still talking about below a dam that's a significant limitation to habitat, and a dam that was put in after the habitat had already been significantly impacted. So the legacy that we're dealing with there is profound, and all the opportunities that we have, I think we really need to seize. And for San Joaquin salmon, for the restoration program, it's the delta, and success coming out of the delta is really a critical piece in that puzzle. We've talked a little bit today about all the different planning efforts that are going on, and just thinking about that whole watershed perspective. The flows into the delta provide that passage for all of the different salmon from this giant portfolio that we're trying to recover. So looking at it synergistically also provides, an opportunity for us to really take advantage of the positive tipping points that I'm sure are out there, but that we're acculturated into not having a great imagination for. So generally, new findings since 2010 in science really support the idea that more flows will be good for fish, that restoration of flow will provide positive benefits. Temperature benefits, buffering the effect of climate change, increasing habitat diversity and population resilience, and supporting improved survival. And I have some of the key points from different pieces of scientific literature that have come out since 2010 there, with just like the gist highlighted in blue. But basically increased flow produces a range of positive benefits. It improves survival, it increases speed of outmigration. It also provides water to inundate floodplain habitat, which increases life history diversity, which supports overall population resilience. And Ted did a great job with his analogy of the express bus, and it's really true. The express bus is just one life history strategy. If you blast the fish through, it might get them through safely, but that's just one life history strategy. But it's also important to remember that when you restore a floodplain, it's not just creating a second life history strategy. It's really like giving all of the fish bicycles and sending them off to pick their own route through a neighborhood. So you're cultivating diversity in what they do, in their potential, and you're taking them off of the 5 out of the express bus. So there's really like a much broader range of benefits there than you might be led to believe just by the idea of a floodplain as sort of one consistent environment. And I think one of the really key points from this list that I want to make is the one down there, the second to last bullet, which essentially says that you can improve flow, or you can improve outmigration, but if you improve survival in that habitat and you improve outmigration, that's the best possible thing you can do. And adding water does both of those things. I also just want to drill down for a minute on the idea, and I mentioned this earlier, but that it's really critical that when we increase flows, we do that in a way that's sensitive to maintaining conditions upstream, and that we really take a watershed perspective on things. And I think the concept of proportional allocation as, you know, a function of unimpaired flow is really critical. The idea of just not sacrificing temperature upstream in order to produce more flow is really critical. There is a challenge there, and we encourage the continued work that's being done in part as a component of the BDCP to figure out how to balance those things. But I think it's just really important to remember that, and this is one of the opportunities in using salmon as an indicator, is that they are an amazing, you know, symbol of continuity in the system. And so they're all coupled together, you know, their early life stages, their later life stages, their range of life history. They span a lot of spatial and temporal scales. So this is all a way for me to say I'd encourage you in your thinking about this to, you know, take steps towards revisioning and kind of refocusing how we approach management of the system, you know, and I just threw that map up there because I like to look at it since it's where I'm from, but also so we can see that whole network all coming down there through that one constriction point. So, you know, in the past, we've really focused management around a single life history, or can we support this one life history strategy? I think we need to expand to look at multiple life history strategies together. I think we can do that with increased flows and habitat, and looking at the way that those things work together. When you have more water, you can do both of those things. And where across the whole watershed, thinking about all of the findings in upstream areas, the necessities in the upstream areas, and also downstream in the delta. And so I just also want to reiterate, building on all of that, some of the recommendations that we included in our written testimonial, you know, that we increase inflow in the winter and spring especially, and that we do it in a proportional way, that we organize it and construct it in such a way that we can be sensitive to the specific needs of floodplain habitat, especially timing of inundation. There's a lot of really good new research on, you know, not all inundation timing is created equal, and you really have to have inundation of a certain duration in order to stimulate the productivity that the fish benefit from. Increasing flow and as a way of maintaining migratory corridors, giving fish away in and out of the system, fish from the whole range of tributaries that use that constriction point. Also maintaining upstream temperature conditions, as I was just mentioning, and then a really robust adaptive management plan. And so as a conclusion, I think, and John did a good job of saying this, I really feel like there's a strong scientific basis for action now, both in terms of the benefits of increased flow and just in terms of the science around the really critical state of our native fish and the pressing need. And I think we can increase flow and provide more water in a way that's sensitive to the rest of the system.
My name's John Kane. I am the Conservation Director for Bay Delta and Central Valley Flood Management Programs for American Rivers. And hopefully you've seen this picture before, so I won't have to tell you about floodplains and how important floodplains are for fish. My presentation is all about floodplains, but hopefully I don't have to convince you that they are actually good for fish. Just what you need to do as a board to make sure we actually get floodplain inundation. So unlike my colleagues on left and right, I'm not a fish biologist, I'm an environmental planner, and I work on figuring out what does the science mean and how to integrate it into plans that will work. And increasingly, what we need to do in California is actually integrate the different plans. I regret that I didn't put on this list of other plans that we need to be thinking about is the San Joaquin River Restoration Plan. But at least the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan is new since the Water Board proceedings in 2010, the Delta Flow proceedings. And there's been a number of BDCP studies regarding floodplain habitat and a bunch of work on the San Joaquin. And the unfortunate thing is that these plans aren't very well integrated. Today, I think you heard from a couple of staff members of the Department of Water Resources pointing out that one of the big problems is that there's a lot of steep banks on the channels, there's a lot of riprap on the channels, and they then therefore argue that increasing flows doesn't really help because all you get is water kind of up in a bathtub. Well, the other half of DWR has been busy putting steep channels and riprap banks. And until very recently, that's a big part of their plan, and there's just not enough integration. I'm pleased
And
to
don't forget, we've got the Corps of Engineers that wants to take all the vegetation off the North Valley levees so it's all consistent, I suppose.
Well, unfortunately, you don't have any authority over the Corps of Engineers unless they divert water. And maybe you do, but I think you maybe have authority over the Department of Water Resources water rights. And if you'd like me to bash the Corps, I'd be happy to oblige, but I've got my hands full already. So,
be careful what I question I ask you in the future.
I'll also say that I'm heartened to see DWR staff genuinely really trying to move forward with floodplain restoration on the Yolo bypass, genuinely trying to move forward with tidal marsh restoration. I think those are great things to do, but as you'll see from my further recommendations, we think that you need to compel them to do these things, not just let them come before you and promise that they're doing them. I have been working on a tidal marsh restoration project with DWR for 12 years. The Dutch Slough Tidal Marsh Restoration Project. I was disappointed that they didn't present on it. There's another one that they've been working on for 12 years. They have the excuse of the Corps of Engineers on that project, McCormick-Williamson. That project's not done. And these projects appear to make it on the list of great things we're going to do, and somehow they just don't seem to be a priority of the Department of Water Resources. Similarly, in 2000, when I worked at the Natural Heritage Institute, I partnered with the Department of Water Resources on a proposal that got funded to look at notching Fremont Weir and increasing the frequency of inundated floodplain habitat in the Yolo bypass. Well, here we are 12 years later, and it's not done. 4 years ago, we were talking about this in BDCP. It's been ordered by the biological opinion. They're very late on their plan. Now, it's great for them to say they finally have some kind of plan to go forward with, which was released last week. They got to move a lot faster if restoration is actually going to be the cure. And as my colleagues have represented, restoration is an important part of it, but water needs to be part of it as well. And it's not realistic to think that in the next 15 years they're going to do all this restoration that they haven't been able to pull off in the last 12 years. Unless somebody ties their water rights to their actions. So I'm going to provide my recommendations on question number 2 first. You asked, what do you do when there's scientific uncertainty?